Hello, my Lynn N Things family and friends. Welcome on back to the channel, guys. It is Saturday, and you guys know what that means. It is story time with Lynn. We're picking up on part 3 of the book that I am reading, Cicely Tyson's Just As I Am. Please remember, we're just reading excerpts from the book. Not trying to read the whole book because I do not own the copyrights to these. But I'm going to read some interesting parts to you guys, and parts that just jumped out at me that I feel like, oh my gosh, I would really love to share. So I hope you have enjoyed part 1 and 2, and now we're going to jump into part 3. Before we do get started, and if you haven't already, please go ahead and hit that subscribe if you like this type of content. This is a new thing I started on my channel. I am Lynn with Lynn N Things. I do a couple things around here on my channel, guys. So usually you guys know me from my Dollar Tree hauls, reviews, some Ray Dunn, DIYs, and maybe little recipes here and there. But yeah, so I do a lot of different little things. But the reading is just something new. I read this book and I feel like it is a treasure. And I just really wanted to share this iconic woman's story because it's just amazing, some of the things that she's went through, and a lot of us can definitely relate. So before we get started with our next couple of chapters, we gotta light our candle, guys. So my candle tonight, I got a little something on it already. It is the Harvest Gnome. So it is a pumpkin patch scent, and y'all, I have burned this before. It smells so good. It's already smelling like caramel to me. So yeah, I can't wait. And so we're using our little matches that I got. This was such a great find at the Dollar Tree, y'all. I really love this. I'm not sure where they got it from, but it's really nice. So we're going to light our candle, and we're going to jump right into our reading. Okay, guys, so we're going to get ready to read. Now, remember, during this time, you can watch if you like to watch, or you can play me in the background, like maybe while you're doing housework, or if you just want to sit and listen. If this is your quiet time of the day, just time to sit down, relax, and listen to a story, then that is perfect to just play me in the background. Thanks, guys, so much for joining in. And don't forget, please share your thoughts down in the comments. What grabbed you? What grabbed your attention? What is something you can relate to? I would really love to hear those comments and those ideas and those revelations down in my comment section. So today, guys, we are on chapter 4 and 5. Okay, the title of chapter 4 is called Transitions. It starts, I was 9, the autumn my world cracked into 2. One early morning in 1934, I awakened, still a child. When the sun closed his eyes on that day, my girlhood, like a fragile vase, had toppled from a table ledge and smashed onto the floor. The previous year, the pungent smell of my father's adultery had drifted into our church. Dad began secretly carrying on with a woman who shared our pews. And from the onset of the liaison, Mom had sniffed it out. For months, she insisted that my father end the affair. And for months, he ignored her. One Saturday evening, Dad stumped up our stairs, raring to go for one of his and my mother's usual rounds of acrimony. The next afternoon, Mom got the last deafening word in their argument. After service, Emily and I stepped outdoors and into an altercation. There, at the foot of the church stairs, my mother was right in the face of the other woman. I want peace in my household, Mom screamed with such force that a shower of spittle landed on the lady's cheeks. Melrose watched from nearby, holding my mother's hat and pocketbook amid the group of church members who had huddled to witness the feud. Get away from my husband and my family, my mother yelled. I cannot recall whether the woman had been in church with us that day, but I will always remember what occurred next. Melrose, out of an instinct to defend our mom, picked up a pebble and threw it at the woman's leg. The shouting ceased. A second later, the scene stirred back to life when Emily and I barreled down the stairs, collected several rocks from the ground, and hurled them at the woman's back. Get away from our mother, I squealed in unison with Emily. My mom, perhaps emboldened by our show of solidarity, resumed her shouting and added shoving. The woman pushed her back. That's when Reverend Byron came outside and leaped toward them. Calm down, he says, attempting to pry them apart. Mom kept on shoving and swinging. "Mrs. Tyson, that is enough," the pastor shouted. Once he'd managed to squeeze his body between the two, that lady could hardly stand. She slowly backed away, straightening up her blouse and inhaling deeply as she did. I tell you, boy, my mother whipped that woman's behind. Thank the Lord none of the stones hit her in the head. With each passing month, my mother's resentment rose. She no longer prepared Dad's supper plates. She'd make our dinner, feed us early, and leave the remaining rice and peas on the stove for him to spoon up for himself whenever he came home. She also refused to wash his clothes. She had thrown his soiled shirts in a tin pail and let them soak in water for days, the washboard resting on the pail's side, beckoning him to pick it up. As Mom saw it, Dad's dirty laundry, cotton and otherwise, was his alone to deal with. One morning when my father was on his way out the door for work, he says to me, "Sis, when you come home from school today, I want you to wash these here underwear for me." He nodded toward the pail overflowing with his long johns, the heavy flannels that my mother had sewn for him. On those days when my father set aside his cart to work at painting at the Triborough Bridge, his thermals kept out the cold. "Yes, Daddy," I said. I had every intention of laundering the underwear, but that afternoon I got so caught up in my homework that I never made it around to that chore. I climbed into bed with absolutely no memory of what my father had asked me to do. Early the next morning, Dad awakened me. "Emily!" And Melrose. Mom, who had a rare day off from work, was still in her house dress and headscarf. "Sister, didn't I ask you to wash out these underwear for me?" he shouted. "Yes, Daddy," I said as I rubbed my eye, "but I forgot." My mother, stone-faced, stared at him from across the living room. Melrose and Emily dropped their eyes to the floor. My hands began to tremor. "Well, I'm going to show every darn one of you something," he shouts. Daddy tore through that apartment, smashing the washboard in half and knocking over the pail of long johns, emptying Mom's freshly made stew out of a cast iron skillet and into the sink. As we looked on in horror, my father stormed into the bedroom and tore the chest of drawers where my mother stashed her earnings. He picked up an iron and propelled its sharpest edge toward the bureau's top and punctured the lock with such power that the drawer could no longer be opened. Mom said nothing. She was as astounded as we were by my father's rampage. "Come on, children, get up from here," she finally urged us. In silence, we put away our rollaway as we glanced around the apartment, surveying the damage, calculating the impact on our family. Once we were all dressed, Mom ushered us outside. She took me by one hand, Emily by the other, and then the three of us walked alongside Melrose to my father's pushcart on 2nd Avenue. Mr. Taylor, who managed the cart with my father, was already there working. Before dusk, Mom arrived at the cart to pick us up. Mr. Taylor presented her with the dollar as he proudly told her about my brother's resourcefulness. She thanked Mr. Taylor and Melrose profusely, and we left. But instead of returning to our apartment, Mom led us to 98th Street and 3rd Avenue. We stopped at a building marked 234 East 98th. Mom led us up a rickety staircase to an apartment on the 4th floor. She pulled out a large silver key, turned it inside the lock, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. Emily, Melrose, and I darted into the 2-bedroom space, peering at our possessions scattered across the living room and wondering, how did they get there? Mom rested a pocketbook on the radiator and said to us, "This is our new home." True to Mom's nature, she let a decade pass before she told me all the distress that day had held for her. After leaving us with Mr. Taylor, she returned to our apartment. By then, my father had gone off someplace. Mom yanked up the bottom corner of her mattress, dug into an open slit that she made with her sewing scissors, and fished out the wad of cash she had been hiding there for months. She counted out $500. She then dashed to the corner store, purchased some boxes. Back in our apartment, she single-handedly packed up the few things we owned. Near the doorway, she stacked her boxes alongside her sewing machine, our beds, and the broken bureau. She did not touch my father's things. Over the next hour, she walked all over our area in search of vacancy signs. She discovered one at 234 and inquired about it. The landlord offered Mom a price she could afford for a place that would still be within walking distance of our school. Within hours of my father's fit of rage, she'd put down a deposit on our new lives. Once she secured the apartment, Mom went to see Reverend Byron. "I'm leaving, Willie," is all she said, her speech steady. He nodded in recognition, requiring no explanation beyond the steadfastness etched on her face. The Reverend offered her one of his moving vans as well as some extra hands. Soon after, he and several deacons arrived at our apartment and helped my mother load up everything. As they hauled the boxes, my father returned home. He stood in the doorway and gaped at the scene before him. "The children and I are leaving," my mother said plainly. "I've already found the new apartment." Our father showed up at the new apartment that evening. How did he know where we were? I wondered as he casually entered. He must have seen the question in my eyes because he said, "Sis, I came to put a new lock on the door." My mother had been the one to give him our address and had even asked him to come and install our new lock on the new door. Her intent hadn't been to ban him from our lives, only to put some distance between their children and his tirades. I wonder if he's going to stay here, I thought. Maybe they made up. They hadn't. But they did put up a peace treaty in place. Dad would be present in our world. He wouldn't permanently reside with us. After leaving our old apartment that morning, he'd rented his own place a few streets away. As Dad unscrewed the lock, his hands shook ever so slightly. Tears welled up in his eyes and threatened to escape. He was absolutely broken. He knew he was to blame, that his womanizing had provoked the rift. In the following years, Mom would often say that the other woman had splintered our home, that she had created so much misery for our family. But in the quietest chambers of their hearts, my mom and dad must have known the reality. That woman spotted a crack in my parents' connection, a fissure that had been forming for quite some time. She simply slid her way into a deep crevice that was already in existence. For some, childhood innocence slips away in small increments over years with the steady tick-tock of the metronome. I lost my wide-eyed naivety in one frightful pendulum swing. In the cadence of a single day, my space and spirit violated, my family irreparably broken. That is chapter 4. I'm going to take just a few minute break right quick, and then we're going to jump right into 5. So if you need to get up and get you a drink or do something, now is the time. Okay guys, we're going to pick up now at chapter 5, The Other America. I saw 2 horror films as a child. One in a theater, another one on a sidewalk in the Bronx. The first frightened the daylights out of me. The second vexed my spirit. The sanctified and the secular were not mixed in our home. So Hollywood films, as part of the latter world, were mostly absent during my upbringing. Emily, Melrose, and I did sometimes watch movies at church in the basement. The youth leaders would string a sheet onto a wall, set up a small projector, and play films that they felt were appropriate for us, like The Little Rascals or any other show with black children in the cast. They wanted to instill in us a pride in our heritage, reflecting back to us on the screen. Those who shared our features was a way to affirm us, even if the characters available to us then sometimes reinforced racial stereotypes. Little Rascals, for instance, was ahead of its time in featuring cross-cultural friendships, but the clueless buckwheat with his wildly spiked hair spoke very little, and when he did, he often mumbled incoherently. Church films aside, never once had my mom taken us to see a movie in a theater. That changed in 1935, the year I turned 11. Though my mother and father had been separated for quite some time by then, they would occasionally still go at it, especially when Dad came by our apartment talking some nonsense. One Saturday during spring, Mom had heard enough and hastened my father on out that door. Soon after, she blurted out a sentence that hadn't ever passed her lips. "Children, we're going to the movies," she said matter-of-factly, as if we regularly took part in that activity. My sister, brother, and I exchanged looks of disbelief and scrambled to put on our clothes. Mom needed to lay down her burdens on this afternoon, and for reasons unknown to me, she chose to lower them in the aisles of a darkened theater. We walked to the Eagle Theater, a movie house at 102nd Street and 3rd. King Kong was playing. We settled into our seats as the lights dimmed and the curtains parted. The moment that massive gorilla pounded onto the screen, my throat closed. I eventually caught my breath, only to lose it again when King Kong thrust his 8-foot hand into that apartment of the blonde starlet, portrayed by Canadian actress Fay Wray. I gasped and buried my face in Mom's shoulder. The year of King Kong brought with it an even more frightful drama. This one from real life chronicles I call Being Poor and Black. After my parents separated, Mom took on more work. By then, she had moved on from her nanny job, but continued as a housekeeper. Between her permanent shifts, she also saw out day-long cleaning jobs. Her clients were well-to-do Jewish families. She'd come home loaded down with shoes and clothes, as well as food left over from the portions she'd made for her employers. This is how I came to enjoy matzo ball and borscht soups. Particularly with her regulars, Mom was embraced as a family member. Though one, of course, not completely in the fold, yes, she was treated with great kindness and felt strongly attached to these families. But at the end of the day, she was still the help. That same year, on a Saturday morning, a few weeks before Easter, Mom says to me, "Take the train to the Bronx this afternoon, and we'll go to Alexander's together." Though she had already made my dress for our most sacred religious holiday, Mom wanted to pick out some new shoes and a pocketbook to complete my ensemble. She scribbled down the address where I was to meet her and handed me the paper. Nomad that I am, I couldn't get myself out of our apartment fast enough. It was raining when I got off at my stop, near the busy shopping district where 3rd Avenue and East 149th Streets intersect. In those days, Alexander's, one of the city's most prominent discount clothing store chains, was in a sprawling building called the Hub, which I spotted upon exiting the L. From there, I began searching for the address that Mom had given me, checking the number on every building, pulling the hood of my raincoat over my forehead to guard from the drizzle. I finally glimpsed the street name Mom had given me. As I turned onto the block, I spotted a group of about 12 black women along the sidewalk. What are these ladies doing here, I wondered. Scanning the faces and recognizing none of them, my mom wouldn't be here. She doesn't know these women. I paced onward, and then suddenly, just as I was walking off, I heard someone say, "Sister." I spun around there. Among the women stood my mother. I looked again at the women surrounding her, struggling to make sense of why they'd all be gathered there in a group. Right then, a white woman approached. She tilted back her umbrella, scanned one of the women from head to toe, and said to her, "Can you start now?" The woman nodded and followed her. A few more white women strolled past and repeated a similar exchange. On the street, a couple of Buicks slowed down alongside us as motorists peered out of their windows at Mom and others. I obviously knew my mother worked as a domestic, but I hadn't grasped the fact. But I'd grasped that fact only in concept. The way I theoretically understood, though, reading the ruthless brutality my ancestors withstood. But on that sidewalk, as onlookers stopped by to evaluate my mom, the agonizing truth of her situation settled over me. I had never imagined my own mother, a queen who wore her dignity as splendorous, flowing like a silk cape, could be in such a position. I never imagined someone so majestic would have to put up her labor for sale while casting her gaze downward in deference to white strangers. That reality cut me deeply, sliced through me the raw flesh of my insides. It stung me in the same way that my Italian classmates' words once had. And just as I'd done then, I shoved down the hurt, locked it behind an unmarked door in my heart, where griefs unimaginable reside. The experience was yet another discovery of how my people were viewed. It was a reminder of our true position in this nation. Like a map with an enormous red dot labeled, "You are here." Black children learn where they stand in this world by recognizing the spaces where our people can and cannot enter, and if granted access, whether our presence and humanity will be regarded as equal. The era I grew up in both deepened my racial wound and soothed it with the healing balm of the arts. My childhood spanned the 1920s and 30s, two of the most economically memorable and culturally rich decades in U.S. history. A period when Negro literature, music, and culture flourished. The roaring 20s rollicked joyously with jazz, decadence, and illegal whiskey, while the thunderous market crash of 1929 rattled the nerves throughout the 30s. What these shifts meant daily life, or whether they had any noticeable consequence at all, depended upon where you lived and how much you were able to earn, both of which were inextricably tied to the color of your skin. The United States has never been one nation under God, but several nations gazing up at him. The United okay. In white America, the 20s may have roared, but in my black world, in what has been called the other America, the decade also moaned. Then, when stock prices plummeted, catapulting the nation into its worst economic downturn, black people knew what we still know. Communities of color are always grappling with financial despair. The fact that the Great Depression was given a name just meant that enough whites were now suffering alongside us to warrant an official title. For the majority culture, the 20s can be summarized in two words: flamboyant excess. The First World War, then the bloodiest in human history, had at last come to an end. However, unsatisfying its conclusion, Americans moved on from their sorrows by throwing back a decade-long soiree. When I came along in 1924, the same year, by the way, that the famous Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade began, the wartime economy had already ushered in unprecedented financial prosperity. In short, Americans had more money than ever, and it was burning a hole in their pockets. Materialism grabbed a hold of them, and it would not stop squeezing. As spending power increased, consumers laid out cash for all manner of luxuries and appliances, like the Ford Model T, automatic washing machines. However, those as poor as we were continued to rely on our manual washboards. We never got a machine. Electric refrigerators. We also never replaced our icebox with a fridge. And phonographs and radios. The day my father brought home a small RCA set and turned it on, I thought, now why is there a voice coming out of that box? Americans also had more to spend on leisure, flocking to see the rash of both silent films and talkies released during those years. The antics of Charlie Chaplin with his mustache and baggy pants drew millions of people to the box office. In 1927, the first talkie, which was named The Jazz Singer, lured theatergoers into enormous movie palaces, as cinemas were then called. The movie business grew into a big business. New York City earned its wings during the 20s. The five boroughs overflowed with more than 5 million residents, moving the city ahead of London as the world's most populous. By boat and by rail, by foot and by any means necessary, immigrant families flooded in, carrying with them the same dreams that my parents had once clutched. During phase one of the Great Migration, millions of colored people, as we were called then, moved from the rural South to New York City and to the urban cities around the Northeast. The nation began tapping its toes to bebop during the Jazz Age. If jazz was America's first musical superstar, then Harlem was the star's grand arena. The 20s, its golden hour. The avenues and alleys vibrated with the sounds of improvisation, of trumpet and piano and syncopated rhythms, seemingly delivered, scattershot, and yet masterfully arranged into a sophisticated whole. The nightclub scene was exactly that, a scene. Anyone eager to cut a step, while relishing big band brilliance, stopped by the Savoy Ballroom, which is the birthplace of the Lindy Hop and land of the Charleston and Foxtrot. Or to the back room, the speakeasy's entrance was hidden behind a bookcase. Jazz stirred at the center of a broader cultural movement, the Harlem Renaissance, a profound social, intellectual, and artistic awakening in Black America that spilled over into all facets of society. Renowned philosopher Alain Locke, who penned the movement's definite text, The New Negro, in 1925, called the era a spiritual emancipation. James Weldon Johnson had his own description for it, a flowering of Negro literature. A historically shackled and voiceless community now demanded its full freedom and its say. It was our first opportunity in this country to define ourselves, to express our unique identity and declare humanity. The chorus of gifted literary voices Locke gathered in The New Negro, which includes essays and poetry and fiction by writers such as Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and Claude McKay, delivered the movement's rallying cry for Black autonomy and self-respect. Locke, who earned his doctorate at Harvard University, was the first Black Rhodes Scholar and served as a philosophy professor at Howard University. Encouraged artists to look to Africa for inspiration. The path to Black progress, he understood, began with self-determination and a regard for our homeland heritage. The question is no longer what whites think of the Negro, he wrote in his anthology, but of what the Negro wants to do and what price is he willing to pay to do it. Locke and his contemporary W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the most distinguished scholars of the 20th century and the author of The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, held differing views about Black aesthetic expression and its role in the movement. And yet the two shared the conviction that the arts were essential to forging a new Black identity. Du Bois founded and edited The Crisis, the flagship publication of the NAACP that gave voice to artists and intellectuals during the Harlem Renaissance and beyond. With the Black elite at its helm, the Renaissance shined its light into every corner of the artistic community, from the literature to the music to the performing and visual arts. Shuffle Along, which was produced, written, and performed entirely by African Americans, debuted on Broadway in 1921, showcasing the talents of Josephine Baker, Paul Robeson, and Adelaide Hall. Aaron Douglas, the eminent painter and graphic artist who produced the illustrations for The New Negro, created hundreds of images that evoked Black pride and captured the Renaissance spirit. When the financial markets collapsed on October 29, 1929, the Roaring Twenties sobered up and whimpered to a close. According to the Library of Congress, the unemployment rolls during the Great Depression swelled 24% for white workers. Black workers sustained double that blow. In 1932, 50% of us were unemployed. These white folks are jumping out of windows and falling out like paper in the wind, my mother observed during the era. Bread lines and soup kitchens formed as Americans struggled for their next meals in a nation where a few short years earlier, surplus had abounded. My own parents and thousands of others relied on government assistance to close the gap between what they could earn and what they needed for basic survival. Over and over in our world, we have witnessed how today's riches can become tomorrow's scarcity. We do well to heed the lesson, y'all. In times of plenty, paucity sits by, licking its lip, awaiting its next grand appearance. It's no wonder that many African Americans still carry a lingering distrust of whites, even those we sincerely love and embrace. Given the horrors of our abuse in this nation, We are understandably wary to ever heal these deep racial traumas, and seldom has it felt more urgent that we do. We must acknowledge that they indeed still exist, throbbing and tender beneath the surface, spilling over like molten rage into the streets. As difficult as it is to recall this country's atrocities, it is essential that every American of every color does. It is critical that we connect the centuries long ugly history with, in our times now, a cop's knee on George Floyd's neck and bullets riddling Breonna Taylor's body. The line from our nation's original sin to its present heartache is not faint or dotted. It is a solid and direct line. And even when the impulse arises to cringe and look away from a system predicated on black oppression, a system that is still doing precisely what it is designed to do, we must stare into the face of our past and examine what has happened here, on our soil. Much of it less than a lifetime ago, a lot of it happening now. Turning a blind eye to our history has not saved us from its consequences. My years played out during these two wildly different decades. The first, a cultural resurrection, and the next, a painful reckoning. In 1939, the last days of the Depression, Billie Holiday stepped bravely up to a microphone at a cafe society in New York's Greenwich Village and sang, for the first time, Strange Fruit, a lyrical protest anthem. The nation's shifting times parallel a spirit of change in our house. After my family fell apart, the basic rhythm of our existence returned, but it swayed to a more sorrowful tempo. Melancholy hung in the air, hovered over our soup bowls at dinner, settled into the cracks of our wood floor. When my mother and father weren't arguing, they didn't talk much. Dad was around a lot, often stopping by our apartment 2 or 3 afternoons a week. When he was there, he and Mom looked past one another, mostly remaining cordial and always maintaining an emotional distance. Much as I wish my family had remained intact, I was relieved to have the late-night battles in our rear-view mirror. Alongside our gloom lived an uneasy peace, for which we'd all paid dearly. Mom and Dad thought would eventually move in with the other woman. He didn't. The two continued their relationship for several months after my parents split, but they ultimately ended things. It perplexes me that, given the freedom to do as he pleased, my father chose not to be with the woman. I'd often wondered whether she regretted her affair with my father, given that, in the end, he did not stay with her. Perhaps Dad never truly wanted to build a new life with someone, but rather craved pursuing the forbidden. After my parents parted ways, Mom took Dad to court for striking her. I was with my father one afternoon when he went to City Hall to review some papers Mom had submitted. Before we boarded the train, we stopped at a 5 and dime store. My eyes fell on a gorgeous cameo pen. Dad, noting my desire, said to me, "Do you want that pen?" And I nodded yes. He purchased it in part because he relished delighting me, and probably also because he wanted to show the judge what a wonderful father he was. He fastened the pen to my collar as I beamed. On the way out, he bought me a ring with 3 faux rubies, one so popular then that practically every little girl had one. As we walked up the stairs to the train, he took my hand and escorted me, as if I was ascending the stairs to my castle. Later, in court, I glided in as the prima donna that I felt like. Despite how much taller I had grown, I was still my father's little string bean, his first girl. He constantly bought me small gifts and bracelets, trinkets, and toys. When I'd return home and show Mom my bounty, she'd muster up a half a smile. Then later, if she got angry with me, she'd spew her resentment. "This man who thinks so much of you. When I was going to the hospital to give birth to you, he had something else to do. And you're supposed to be his favorite." She would often throw that in my face. The year my parents separated is the year my brother, then 11, began running away from home. Mom often said that Melrose, like me, was born restless, led by a spirit that called to him. He'd sometimes be gone for days at a time, long enough to frighten the hair off my mother's head. She'd walk the streets searching for her firstborn, for her heartstring. She'd find him sitting on a bench, staring off as if something as in the distance had captured his attention. "Where you been all this time?" my mother would ask him as she led him home. He'd shrug, continue gazing. "And what did you eat?" she'd prod. He'd mentioned that a kind man in our neighborhood would often spot him outdoors and then return to hand him a cup of milk. For years into his adulthood, Melrose wouldn't touch milk, probably because he associated with those distressing times. He was a troubled child, my brother. We each had our way of handling the misery of our situation, and Melrose drifted all out into the streets, even as he drew inward. Emily dealt with our new reality by blaming my mother. My sister, though seldom one to withhold her opinions, said little to me then about our family's tearful transition. But years later, when we were grown, she revealed that she mostly held our mother accountable. She and Melrose had slept through much of the conflict that I had witnessed. What Emily did see had been enough to unnerve her, and yet, however poisonous our family dynamic was, she still desperately wanted our father there with us. At the center of it, she faulted my mother for walking away, not understanding that my father had long since made an emotional departure. In retrospect, I understand Emily's assessment, not as an indictment of my mother, but as a way to cope with her own anguish. When your heart has been sliced wide open, you tend to haphazardly hurl rocks in every direction. You want someone, anyone, to ache and bleed as badly as you have. You cast stones and aspirations the way the children once did at the other woman. After my mother left my father, we moved to a different church. Mom wanted a fresh start from the public disgrace. She couldn't stand the idea of my father's infidelity following her through the pews of St. John's. As we settled into our second church home, we were just as involved as we had been at the first. Mom attempted to groom Emily as a pianist, hoping she might one day play in church. She also wanted to imbue all of us with some culture, as well as keep our minds and hands productively occupied. After purchasing beds for us, the next thing Mom bought was a ramshackle upright piano, which we scooted against a wall in our living room. Mom brought it from a black lady from the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson, who gave Emily lessons at 25 cents per session. But Emily didn't take to the keyboard. "I want to play the violin," she told my mother, backing up to evade the dotted eye she knew was coming. "When you get old enough to go to work and you can buy a violin," my mother retorted, "then you can get one yourself." Since my brother had no interest in the piano, he would often pick up items that he could find and turn them into drumsticks. I tell you, if my mother hadn't steered him away from what she thought was too worldly of an artistic passion, Melrose might have been a great drummer today. I was the last remaining potential pianist in the house. After Emily quit within weeks of her first lesson, I began my lessons with Mrs. Wilson when I was 10. At 12, I could play every hymn in our church hymnal. At 15, I was accompanying both our congregation and the choir. I had such a knack for it that I also taught myself how to play the organ. The piano provided me with the consolation I needed to at least give up my thumb. One day when I was around 12, I stuck it in my mouth, pulled it out again, and stared at it for the longest time. Wait a minute, I thought. What happened to you? You don't taste so good anymore. From then on, the piano served as the purpose that my thumb had always. It became my solace. During long afternoons as the sun's mango rays painted shadows on our walls, I'd sit hunched over those chipped keys, soothing myself with the message of the hymn that has become my daily meditation. Just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou bid me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. In a home, a family uprooted, that song became my safe haven, my grace note. There, in the measures of that musical prayer, I find comfort still. And this is the end of chapter 5, guys. Thank you so much for spending this time with me for our third part of this book. This was really, really eye-opening. Some of the things that, she witnessed and saw as a child. And I'm sure some of you guys probably have witnessed some of these type of things as well. So don't forget to go ahead and put your thoughts in the comments. Thank you again for stopping by. See you next Saturday.